Afternoon, everyone. When we planned these afternoon sessions, we thought, well, you know, February, it'll probably be snow and ice, and it'd be better to have it in the afternoon. We had no idea it was going to be South Florida in Nebraska. So thank you for coming out. You could be on the golf course or working on your tan or doing something important like that. I'm Dave Forsyth. I'm a member of the organizing committee. I'm pinch hitting for Peter Levitoff, who woke up this morning and was not feeling all that well. He normally does this sort of introduction in a very smooth and polished way. So I'm pinch hitting at the last moment. I'm happy to do that. And so again, I want to welcome everyone who's here in person. And last week at the first session by Sean Trundle on the history of the America First Committee, we had twice as many online as we had in person. So again, our theory about how people would come out in the afternoon, and well, it's okay. It doesn't matter whether people are in person or online. Again, a welcome. Thank you very much. As some of you know, this series started back in 1985 at Divine Congregational Church. And for reasons I don't know and don't need to know, the series was transferred here in 2000. So this church has been the host for 25 years, and before that there was another church that was the host for 15 years. So various people have managed to keep it going for quite a while. I would like to thank the church for being a very good host for the series. I'd like to thank Jason, our technician, and the members of the organizing committee. I know that some of those people are here. And there is, I think, a social committee at the church that arranges things for the break in the middle. I'd also like to thank Humanities Nebraska for financial help with this series. The format, I think you know. We have a speaker for the first 45 minutes or so. We take a break then for 10 or 15 minutes. There are usually some refreshments in the lobby. You can stretch your legs, use the restrooms if you wish, which are that way. And after the break, then we have Q&A. So the first part is given to the speaker, and the second part is entirely Q&A. For those online, we ask you, if you have comments or questions, to use the chat function, and Jason will monitor the information that comes in online. And so in the Q&A, people online will have a chance to have their voice heard, as well as the people in the audience. This is the second in the series this year. Next week, we're taking a week off, a kind of spring break, if you will. And then we have 2 more sessions after that. Next week, this room was not available, and so we're having 2, a break, and then 2 more. And if you missed the first presentation, you can go to the church's website, just Google Unitarian Church Lincoln, and then when you get on the website, look for Winter Lecture Series, and you can see eventually all of the lectures, which will be kept there in video form. And I think, unless Parks or somebody wants to remind me of something I'm forgetting, we can proceed to the substance, which is what you came for. Uche Jarrett did his undergraduate work in Nigeria. He concentrated on mathematics and statistics, and he eventually did a PhD at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. He specializes in different aspects of economics, being an associate professor of practice in the UNL Department of Economics. And so he teaches courses and does research on monetary economics, development economics, economics and ecology, and also trade. And he is a fellow at the Clayton Yider Institute of Trade and Finance at UNL. So he wears 2 hats, one in economics and one in trade and finance. And he's also involved in the International Business Program at UNL. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, who has the floor for about 45 minutes. We're delighted you could be with us, Professor Jarrett.
I'll say this, I never get tired of hearing people applaud when I walk. It's so good to hear. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be here. Thank you. You can do that. I'm not going to stop. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm going to try to keep this succinct because I tend to get excited and I tend to talk a lot more than I should. So I was asking him about the time limit for this because that is my proclivity. Today what I'm hoping to spend a lot of my time doing is telling you guys stories. But because I'm a teacher, I can't help myself. For the first 10 or 15 minutes or so, I'm going to try to give you some insight into why trade policy in and of itself is generally beneficial, why it's meant to be pursued, why countries would go after it, and I'll talk about that first so we have context for what we will do later on. The second part of the discussion that I'm going to try to provide you is a historical account of things that have happened that are related to trade policy and how we can sort of tie that to what's going on today. So we're going to go through this evolutionary path from the 1840s up until 2025, and I've chosen some select few incidences that I would like us to sort of explore a little bit and discuss. That gives us that context that we're talking about. So hopefully by the time I'm done, and in that 45 minutes, I should have been able to do 2 of these things. Like I said, my name is Uche Jarrett. Sorry, I'm having trouble moving the slides again, so maybe you want to click on. Yeah, there we go.
Damn, he's cute.
Yeah, I mean, that was taken 10 years ago when I started. But I appreciate that. Just giving you a sense of who I am. I think Dave's done a fantastic job of summarizing my life in the last 10 years. But I'm originally from Nigeria, hence the name Uche Chukwu. I go by Uche because that's easier for my students to pronounce. I was born in Nigeria. I was raised in Nigeria, so I have this perspective that is not as common as you would find. And so having experience living in a developing country versus a developed country, I've always thought that I brought something a little bit different to the understanding of international discourse, and I'll try to highlight that as I go. My education is relatively straightforward. I was a math and stat major. I wanted to look for something that I could apply that to in the real world, and that's what led me to economics, doing a PhD in econ, teaching in econ, doing research in economics, and most recently doing a little bit of consulting in the econ space. I've worked with the African Union to try to get some programs together in the last year or so, and I do a little bit as part of the BBR, which is our business bureau in the econ department. So I try to do a lot, but a lot of it is practice, and so I enjoy the opportunity to have these discussions with people and talk about economics. I'll try this again and see if that's working. Still no. Okay. I don't hope you can see this because I can't, but what I have here is an outline of my discussion. Like I said, the first thing I want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit about understanding trade policy in general. What trade policy is intended for. What I'm going to focus on really is this idea of export promotion. Why would countries want to engage in international trade policies? What are they trying to accomplish, and what's the goal and what's the whole point? So we'll talk a little bit about the benefits, we'll talk a little bit about the costs, and talk about what the mitigating factors are for trade policy in general. So when we understand that objective as to what trade policy is, what it means, what it implies, then we can better understand the history of trade policy within itself, which I will start talking about, like I said, starting with an example in Japan. That Japanese example that I'm going to start with, I'm going to draw parallels to what happened in Venezuela recently. Again, the motivations for some of the activities. Again, there are some similarities and there are some differences, but I hope you can see the connection between the two. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the history of tariffs in general. We'll talk about some important trade policies across U.S. history as it pertains to what we're doing today. Specifically, we'll talk about the Smoot-Hawley Act in the 1930s. We'll talk a little bit about the trade war with China in 2018. We'll talk about NAFTA and the renegotiation in 1994. And we'll talk a little bit about the blanket tariffs that we had imposed in 2025. And so that's sort of the pathway that I want to take to get us to where we need to go. I'm going to talk a little bit about how trade policy has sort of changed in the United States recently, how trade policy is now being strategically applied to obtain certain concessions in certain areas. This has not been historically the use of trade policy, but this is something that we are seeing more and more coming out of the United States. And then I'll talk about the ideas of what modern trade policies generally will look like, what they're trying to accomplish, because it's moving beyond just trade and going into certain areas that supposedly will be beneficial for everybody. So that's kind of my path that I want to use as part of this discussion. Let's go again. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is understanding trade policy. And this is where I said I will beg your indulgence and teach for a few minutes. Can you go to the next slide, please? The one thing I want to stress is trade policy objective is to get people to external sources. Its primary goal, for example, when I talk about export promotion, I wanted to talk about this graph instead of giving an official definition of export promotion because I thought this did a really good job of explaining the idea behind export promotion. What I have here in these lines, the very first one that you can see here, if I can point to this, but I'll try to describe it. The red line that you see right there at the top represents agricultural production in the United States over the last 100 years or so. And the lines that are below are consumption and exports. And the main thing I wanted to draw your attention to here is the fact that we produce a lot more than we can consume. And that difference has to go somewhere. That difference facilitates economic growth. It continues to grow the agriculture industry in the United States. And so external markets are pivotal in getting us that growth. Without external markets, we can't grow. We have to reduce our production to what we consume. If you notice, the other line that's very close to our consumption that's over there is also exports. We're exporting agricultural goods as much as we are consuming them. So we have access to foreign markets that give us this opportunity to sell. And that's really the driver behind trade policy. The goal is to get access to these markets, but there are also some negative effects that we will generally talk about. If we think about this for the case of the United States, if we think about how does it affect Nebraska specifically? Could you go to the next slide, please? And this was a slide that I put together just because I know I'm talking to people from Nebraska, so I wanted this to mean a lot more to us than just a generalization of what's going on in the US. Nebraska specific, the three largest exports in Nebraska, soybeans, beef, and corn. In Nebraska, we are the #1 state for exporting beef. We're #3 for exporting corn and feed, and exports account for 30% of our annual agricultural output in the state. So just 30% of our products go outside of the country. It was $8.2 billion in 2024, which was down from the highest of $12.7 billion in 2023. And it's responsible, just that export component is responsible for about 250,000 jobs in the in Nebraska alone. Now, this was all information that was put together by the Jarrett Institute of International Trade and Finance. They have a very wonderful website, so I'm going to do a plug for them as well. If there's information that you guys are looking for with respect to trade, you will most likely find it there, especially when it comes to Nebraska. So please, if you have some time, go ahead and check it out and take a look. Let's go to the next slide. Part of the discussion that presents a negative effect of trade policy or the negative sides to the United States comes primarily from import competition, where if you open up other markets, the owners of those markets want to come into your country as well. And so while we like the exporting piece, the importing piece generally tends to create some problems of its own. And what I have here are just a bunch of graphs to kind of show the evolution of exports of agricultural products and imports of agricultural products. And what I've plotted right at the bottom is trade balance, the difference between exports and imports. If it's positive, it's good. We're sending out more than we're receiving. If it's negative, not so much. And what we see is a downward trend. And in the last 5 years or so, this has been a negative effect. And so there is a significant amount of import competition in the United States. And so trade policy tries to both expose the US to other markets where they can benefit, but then somehow mitigate the negatives that are associated with that kind of international exposure. And so that's really the goal associated with that. There are other things that are implied when it comes to trade policy, so I'll go to the next slide. Just to give you a sense of the issues that are there, even though we want to export dependence may in and of itself be a negative thing. If you are entirely beholden to a foreign country as a market for your production, any shocks in that country are generally transferred to you. And this was the primary way that we saw the 2008 financial crisis propagate across different countries. It started as a financial issue, but then it became a negative income shock for a whole host of countries. And so we started seeing these negative effects propagate over time. So export dependence is really not something you want, so that has to be mitigated as well. We've talked a little bit about import dependence, and we'll talk about the trade war between China and the United States in 2018. And part of that discussion was a lot of reliance on primary goods that were crucial for US's defense, or at least this was the justification for a lot of the tariffs that were put in place, like steel and aluminum, that would negatively impact the United States' war readiness. And so it was deemed a threat to national security. As a result, tariffs were put in place. What I would say is more appropriate to what we see today is rare earth metals that we use for most of the electronics that we have access to. It is integral to our technology infrastructure, and as a result, we need steady access to these types of things. And so being incredibly reliant on other countries for this will put the US at a disadvantage in that context. And so there is a lot of effort that goes into using trade policy to secure those rights to those things in all these different countries. We've had discussions with Ukraine, we've had discussions with China, we are having discussions with countries in the Central African region to sort of get access to these as well. So again, the reliance on these critical materials is problematic, and so making sure that they are readily available is a very important strategy that's associated with trade policy. So you don't really want to be too dependent on imports. There are also dumping concerns. This is typically when people sell in your country a lot less than they sell in theirs. Again, remember the point of accessing external markets is to increase your economic growth potential. And so sometimes it might be beneficial for you to produce domestically, but have nowhere to put it, so you take it to another country and you sell off at very low prices. Because that is detrimental to those countries you sell them in, we call that dumping. And then we have these anti-dumping policies that need to be put in place, and all of that is also part of trade policy. Also concerns outsourcing, where you're looking for cheap labor to assemble, for example, producing outside of the country, having jobs exported to other places. That's all part of what trade policy tries to mitigate or actually address. And you can think of intellectual property appropriation, which is a really big deal when it comes to consequences of outsourcing as well, because the policies and the laws that exist in another country don't necessarily relate to or mirror the laws that we have in the United States. And so there's exposure to a lot of intellectual theft abroad, and that creates its own set of problems. Okay, so just wanted to give you a very quick, very fast, very quick description of some of the intricacies that are associated with trade policy, some of the issues that are associated with it, and one of the big points and benefits that we generally tend to think trade policies accomplish. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So now I'm going to stop teaching for a second and try to tell you the stories that I want to tell you. So we're going to start with our history of trade policy. But the first thing I wanted to do, I wanted to talk about the relationship between the United States and Japan. And this is a really interesting story that reminded me a lot of what happened recently in Venezuela, that I thought I would start here just to show the connection between how things used to be and what we may potentially be returning to in terms of strategy to deploy trade policy internationally. If you go one more slide, please. Again, hopefully you can see this, but in 1854, there was a Treaty of Kanagawa that was signed between the US and Japan. In 1853, at that time, China had opened up its borders with some persuasion from the European countries, and the US had just annexed California. So there was a lot of Pacific trade that was going on between the US and China. The US had coal-powered steam engines at the time to facilitate that trade in the Pacific, and they needed a place to restock, resupply, and refuel. They didn't have a lot of options because at the time, Japan, which would have been ideal because they had those resources and could actually help US ships, was primarily closed. They were not interested in any sort of contact with anybody internationally, and they chose to just remain isolated. Any overtures from the United States were rebuffed. And so because that need was pressing, the US deployed Commodore Matthew Perry. He went to Japan with 4 battleships, parked it outside, and threatened to use force if they did not trade with the US, or if they did not carry out some kind of deal or trade, and that was what led to that Treaty of Kanagawa. And I thought to myself, this draws certain parallels. And even though just threats were put in place the last time, and military action was actually taken out here, there's a lot of similarities. It is a strategic country of interest. They had resources that they were interested in, and there was a deployment of, or some intended use of force in that area. So I drew those parallels to say, this is not an isolated incident. This is the part of trade policy or foreign policy in general that we tend not to really see a lot of, but maybe making a comeback. And not just in the US, internationally as well. We've seen these different types of events. So I wanted to start there to sort of draw those 2 parallels. One thing I did want to point out is that the connection between the story and trade policy in general is that 4 years later, there was actually a trade policy between Japan and the United States that was officially signed. This was because of what we call a most favored nation agreement between the two that was struck during that period where force was sort of implied. The most favored nation agreement basically guarantees that any offer that Japan makes to any other country will also be offered to the United States. And so that was where the talks were starting, and then 4 years later we had the Harris Treaty, and we had our first trade deal with Japan. Okay, I'll go to the next discussion, and this is really the first incidence of tariffs in the U.S. One more slide, please. All right. Tariffs are not new. Tariffs are part of trade policies. Tariffs help us mitigate that unwanted import competition by limiting how many goods come into the country and stifling the competition that it raises, allowing generally growing industries to thrive and stay in a bubble outside of the global markets until they're ready to better compete. And so tariffs were used a lot. The intent for tariffs in the past had been for revenue generation. First recorded incidences of tariffs were in Sumeria, in ancient Mesopotamia in 3000 BC, where we've seen on stone tablets that people had carved and said you would pay a tax if you came into our country with goods and services. So the idea has existed for quite a while. But in the US, it was first used July 4th in I want to say that's 84? 89. All right, I'm trying to see the little writing over there, but I can't. And it was primarily driven by revenue generation. This was the goal of Alexander Hamilton, who was the Treasury Secretary at the time, and he said, we need to generate revenue. And the quickest way for us to do this is to charge tariffs for goods that are coming into our country. And that was the primary goal. This was primarily because state capacity, which is essentially how governments govern, or the infrastructure in which they have for governing, didn't really exist at that time. And so the quickest way for the US government to generate revenue was that. And even at that point, James Madison was also of the belief that tariffs could be used as a negotiating tool to basically get preferential treatment from other countries, which is very similar to what we are seeing being used now, where a threat of a tariff is used to sort of get some sort of concession. And so these were ideas that were bandied about at that point in time, one revenue generation and the other as a strategic tool to get favor for the United States. Revenue generation won out, and for a long time that was how the US government was funded. There's been a lot of discussions where people have said perhaps a return to using tariff revenue in and of itself to replace income taxes, for example, should be the norm that the government pursues. I've had a few students ask me that, and I'm going to talk about that today because we're in this tradition. It's not possible. The reason why it's not possible is that tariffs of itself is a limiting mechanism. Tariffs are designed to limit international trade. And so you are putting a clock or a limit on how much revenue you can actually generate, because you will get to a point where you raise tariffs that are high enough that it offsets all international trade. And everybody just trades domestically. At that point, your source of revenue is cut off, which means we can't go back to relying on just tariff revenues only. Plus, tariff revenues have not made a significant contribution to government revenue for a very long time. If you go to the next slide for a second, what I have here again, hopefully you can see this, on my right-hand side is the amount that we've collected in tariffs for the last about 15 years. We've collected the highest tariff revenue in 2025. And if you look here on my left, that first orange bar is showing you tariffs as a fraction of GDP. It is not up to 1%. And that is the highest that we've collected. So we cannot necessarily replace our income tax system with tariff revenue generation. That is just going to be very difficult to do, and like I've said, oddly self-defeating, because at some point in time, it will disappear. So the idea of using tariff revenue to replace income tax revenue, just the math doesn't work. And so we're not going to see that happen anytime soon. Next slide, please. In general, tariffs, while in the past have been used for revenue generation, that changed with some policies in later 1800s where The recommendation was to reduce the tariffs because they realized that it was causing too many issues and replace some of that with income taxes. It was going to be a 2% income tax to replace some of the lost revenue that came from tariffs, and then there was some pushback until that was formalized in the 16th Amendment in 1913. So that's where our income tax replacement came in, and it took off because there was no upper limit for that. If you are looking to grow the country and you're taxing a fraction of that growth, then you will always generate as much revenue to keep up with the growth as you want. And so there's no internal mechanism that limits revenue generation in that same way, which is why income taxes, as much as we don't like them, are generally the way that we see government revenue generation happening for quite some time. The biggest, the discussion I'm about to have now is really the biggest reason why economists such as myself are terrified when people start talking about raising tariffs. Because this is the example that we point to. This is the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930. This was historically the largest tariffs that we've ever had put in place. And this was because it was built on top of other tariffs. The time during the Great Depression was just, for lack of a better word, terrible across the board. There was low production, no jobs, low income, low consumption. And a lot of that was driven primarily by the Great Depression itself. A lot of European countries before 1930 had been crippled by the First World War and we're still trying to recover. What is important to note is that tariffs at this point in time were already pretty high. There was already, on average, about a 25 to 40% tariff that was imposed from the, I forget the name, let me see if I can look at it, Fordney-McCumber Act in earlier, I think it was between 1915 and 1925. So we already had significantly high tariffs, which meant that any additional tariffs were not going to do the same type of job we thought they were going to do. Now, the folks who proposed the Smoot-Hawley Act, the rationale was sound. If we limit competition that we believe is responsible for slowing down our production, our domestic producers would produce more, right? And when they produced more, they would have to do that by hiring people, which means people will receive more income. And that way we can boost consumption and our economy internally can start to grow. And that cycle will continue and continue. But the problem was, it wasn't a result of competition because the European firms or the European companies were not really at the point where they could send as much of their goods to the United States. But more importantly, when the Smoot-Hawley Act was put in place, these countries retaliated because those producers in the US were generating as much revenue as they were, even though it was depressed in that particular period, in these European countries. So when they retaliated with tariffs of their own, it dried up those markets for those American producers, which exacerbated the issues. So we saw more job losses, not less. And if you think about what international trade in and of itself does, when goods come into the US, they come in at a lower price. And so the amount of goods and services that consumers were able to afford because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff raising those prices also saw consumption go down. And so every single thing that was put in place to sort of help the economy in as well-meaning a way as possible actually turned around and hurt the economy. And a lot of people believed that this is what made the Depression last longer and become as bad as it did until it was taken out. And to give you a sense of how bad things got, the Congress actually at this point in time voted to give the president control of setting tariffs. When else are we going to think about that again? Because this is where it started, right? This was where the inception came from. And the reason was he could negotiate deals much quicker and get us out of this situation much faster. And there were a ton of different trade deals the U.S. struck at that point in time to alleviate the stress that was driving the economy under. And so this, again, like I said, consequences of those particular actions. What was really interesting about this time period was a lot of those retaliatory tariffs and the narrative that it spread around the world, some people believed was actually responsible for the rise of extremism. These extreme political viewpoints that people had because of the suffering these different retaliatory tariffs had, in these economies. Some people even say Adolf Hitler was a result of this particular type of discussion. So there are extents beyond just trade policy in and of itself. So again, when we as economists, as trade economists, we see people raising tariffs, especially in large open economies that have a lot of international economic consequences, we start to worry because this is our reference point. Let's go to the next slide. Just wanted to show you again what I mean when I say we worry. What I have on the left here is a plot of average global tariffs over time. That spike in the middle is the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and we can see it was already climbing in the past. But since the Great Depression, average world tariffs have dropped significantly over time. What I have on the right-hand side is the average US tariffs that have been put in place over time as well. And we see that after the Great Depression, it has pretty much dropped off significantly up until it shot right up in 2025. And so when we talk about our nervousness, that's our comparison. That's the viewpoint that we draw on, because a lot of what happened then, even though we're not near there at that point, a lot of the negative consequences that were generated because of limitation of trade, we can still sort of see. I'll tell you this about economists in general. Everything we do is cost benefit. However you think about it at the end of the day, it is, what is the cost of this? What is the benefit of this? So when it comes to trade, it's really about who is benefiting. Consumers are the ones that benefit from trade a lot, and there are a lot more consumers than there are producers. So every single time we see a tariff, generally, it is a net loss because of the negative effects on consumers. It doesn't mean that there aren't benefits. It just means that we think a lot more people lose than gain. And so we start to get very antsy when it comes to things like this. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, if you look at the whole of the United States compared to the rest of the world, have the products that we export, we have a higher tariff compared to products that come in, they pay a lower tariff. Is that a fair statement?
That could be a first. So the first thing I'll say is, without being specific, there are a lot of goods, there are lots of tariffs, and lots of countries have different average tariffs that they charge. I'll give you an example of how complicated this can actually be. So for example, Canada has a tariff on dairy products coming in from the US, but that tariff only kicks in after it reaches a quota. So if the US sends in X amount of dairy products, no tariffs. Once you get to a particular point, anything higher than that, then there is a very significant 300% tariff or something like that. The US has never reached that cutoff point. So that tariff is effectively pointless. And so these are the types of things that I'm usually very careful about blanket statements that say, because if you look, technically there is a 300% tariff on dairy products going from the US to Canada, but it's not effective. And a lot of times, one of the reasons why countries put in tariffs is as a protectionist policy. And mostly developing countries are the ones who are protecting their industries. The US doesn't need to protect their industry. And so most of the time, there's no need for them to justify a tariff for goods coming in. Well, I say this pre-2025. But generally, if you think about goods that are coming in from places like Indonesia or Pakistan, those are relatively cheap goods that people in the US want to buy. So putting tariffs would, again, create that negative effect on consumers. But when you think about goods from the US going into other countries, those countries have industries that are still trying to catch up with the United States. And so they have more of an incentive to put higher tariffs. So from that theoretical blanket standpoint, I can say you could make the argument that they have higher tariffs than the US would. This would be true when you're looking at developed versus developing countries, but I can't make the same argument for example, Europe and the United States. The one thing I will say about Europe, though, is that they are very skittish about things like genetically modified goods and produce, and so there usually is a higher tariff on things coming into their country for stuff like that across the board. I hope that answers partially your question. I hope you're looking for a yes or no. Sorry. All right. So the general idea is having these general hikes in tariffs over time. I'll go to the next slide, please. So here, I wanted to talk a little bit about NAFTA in Mexico because I think it's a really interesting parallel to draw. It turns out that in 1993, the United States government was worried that there was going to be a crisis at the border at Mexico. Does that sound familiar again? Yeah. And so their strategy at that time, was to create what they called stay-at-home Mexican middle class. Essentially, the idea was to expose the U.S. economy to Mexico to make sure that Mexican middle class grew so we wouldn't have a lot of people trying to move into the United States and avert the border at the crisis at the border. And so that was the whole impetus behind NAFTA, because at that point, Canada and the US were already trading together. And so the deal with NAFTA was to include Mexico into this agreement to make sure that they saw some of the benefits as well. Again, with the best of intentions. However, the trade deal, NAFTA, didn't really offer any protections or guarantees for labor. And most of the benefits usually accrued to people who were investing and who were capital owners and the rich. And so they saw a lot of revenue go to the rich at the expense of those who were actually the ones that were meant to benefit from this. And so we didn't actually see the middle class grow, we saw it shrink. We saw that trade did increase between the US. We saw that production in Mexico really went up. But real wages, how much people can buy over time, dropped significantly by 60 to 80%. And so the crisis we were trying to avoid was not avoided. It was actually exacerbated, which led to the same crisis that we saw today. It's just dealt with differently now. This was the approach then. NAFTA was renegotiated to sort of correct some of the shortcomings to the United States that were sort of the general idea. Because the intent for the original, and I was opportune to speak to one of the negotiators on that original NAFTA agreement. And that was essentially their point. They weren't going into those negotiations to get the best outcome for the US. They were going into it to see how they could make sure Mexico was self-sufficient so they didn't become a potential issue later on down the line. And so some of that was addressed. A majority of what the new agreement did, the USMCA, which, funny story, it's called something different in every single country. The US puts their name first, Canada puts their name first, and Mexico puts their name first. So it's 3 different things in 3 different countries, just because they wanted to go first. But the idea being that a majority of what they did was to redefine what it meant to be produced in North America. So we have these content rules, essentially. If 60% of the good is made in the North American countries, either Mexico, the United States, or Canada, then it would be subject to very low tariffs. But if more than 60% was made elsewhere or something like that, then you would actually face the tariffs that were introduced. There was a lot of discussion about how China was trying to circumvent any sorts of tariffs that were put in place by building plants in Mexico or in Canada to sort of benefit from the opportunities that NAFTA and the USMCA provided. And so a lot of the discussion was really about content and how you could basically define what it meant to be made in North America. And so that is still an ongoing discussion. The USMCA came up for a reevaluation last year. They're still working out some kinks. The hope is that it continues to remain in force, but it's going to look slightly different than it did before. So all they were trying to do was to make sure that the U.S. didn't necessarily lose as much in the past. It's really fascinating to hear the folks who are having these negotiations discuss the important things they talk about and what they pay attention to. It's very different from what we consider in academics. And so having the ear of those people who are participating has just been fascinating to me, and it's part of the Yada Institute. I've been really glad to be a member of that. But I thought it was interesting to sort of talk about this because of where we still sort of see the border, at the crisis at the border, and how it's being addressed now versus how it was addressed back in 94. Sorry, next slide. So now I'll talk a little bit about the trade war with China. I will try to be quick. In 2018, the U.S. went after China in very specific ways. I wanted to take some time here to talk about 3 different rules of law that came from tariff policy in the United States. The first one was, if I can see, Section 201. This is when you can impose a tariff on certain goods and services because they have, sorry, I can't see that. I'm gonna take a step in here. Yes. This is when you have rights to protect the domestic industry, Section 201. And so the idea is the US felt that certain producers of solar panels and things like washing machines were suffering because of import competition, and so they wanted to protect those relatively nascent industries as well. So that's what the rationale for imposing those tariffs were. Section 232, this is the one that had to do with national security. The idea is that steel and aluminum were required products if the US wanted to go to war, and they did not want to be dependent on who could potentially be a hostile country for its supply. And so they wanted to make sure that the production of those goods was in-house. And then the last one was Section 301. This is when you impose a tariff because you feel the countries you're imposing them on are carrying out unfair trade practices. Primarily, the feeling was that China was engaged in subsidizing their production in the country with their firms, giving them an unfair advantage. And so the US was essentially trying to combat that. And those were the rationales that were given for the tariffs that were imposed in 2018. The beneficiaries of the trade war between the US and China, because of course China retaliated on agricultural products in the United States that had negative effects on ag states in the US, were actually Vietnam, Thailand, Korea, and Mexico. Because we saw a lot of trade creation in those countries. When the vacuum existed between the US and China, they came in. Specifically Vietnam and Thailand. A lot of the production in China moved to these countries, most of the time set up by Chinese firms as well, again, to circumvent the same trade war that we saw. And a lot of South American countries actually benefited from the trade war because China was able to reposition their imports of agricultural products from South American countries. And so there always are these international consequences that arise when we look at any sort of trade policy implementation between 2 big countries that the US and China are economically. All right, let's move one more. So I'll talk very briefly about the 2025 blanket tariffs. We saw the announcement on Liberation Day where the discussion was primarily about imposing a 10% tariff across the board for every single country, and there was some talk of some sort of reciprocal tariff that was implied, again, based on this notion that countries were unfairly tariffing the US either directly or indirectly with respect to prices. There are a couple of things that I will, if I had time, would have said about all of that, but to keep things relatively simple, these tariffs have actually allowed the US to generate a significant amount of tariff revenue, like I showed you before. What they've done is we have not seen a great deal of retaliation across the board. And people have asked why that is. And I think that is more of a strategy than anything else. If we go back to the Smoot-Hawley Act, most of these countries retaliated because this was American trade policy. This was not a short-term thing that they expected to run out. I think the difference is that now this is an indication of one person or one person's approach to trade policy in the United States. And so there's a feeling that if we ride this out, right, we will probably have a different environment in 3.5, 4 years, right? And so a lot of people are, again, international countries, are sort of playing along until this time. Now, my personal belief is if there was a chance of a second term or an indication that whoever came afterward was going to continue these same policies, as aggressive as they are or however you choose to put them, we might have seen a little bit more retaliation from foreign countries. And we might have seen some escalation that we were sort of afraid that we were going to see, very much in the case of China. But again, this is where the discussion of the imposition of tariffs and sort of weaponizing tariffs to gain some sort of concession from foreign countries has kind of been used. It's more of a tactic now to all right, we have the ability to impose tariffs because you want access to our markets. If you give us this, then we will be able to sort of reduce this and give you a fair treatment. And that's the same sort of policy that James Madison all the way back in the 1800s was really trying to push, and that's what we're seeing kind of put more in place. Next slide, please. So this is, I put this slide together to give people a sense of what trade partnerships look like in the modern day. A lot of what the US tried to do with those tariffs that were put in place with China, these Section 232 and 301s and 201s, were to sort of mitigate China's economic footprint in the international market, to curb some of the more harmful or potentially harmful activities that China was going in with respect to intellectual property and things like that. But a different approach had already been negotiated during the Obama administration. The Trans-Pacific Partnership between countries in every single continent, 12 of them including the United States, were negotiated along a bunch of different rules. Safeguards for labor that people have argued have been exacerbated because you're looking for the lowest price point in the international market, so trade is taking advantage of a lot of people. So they had labor safeguards that prevented partner countries from actually engaging in any kind of harmful behavior to labor. They had intellectual property rights that were guaranteed. They had climate conservation concerns that were associated with trade flows. So basically, building into trade policy and trade deals all of these provisions that extended beyond trade and achieved a positive outcome. The United States pulled out of it during the first Trump administration, and the rest of the 11 countries went in and went ahead. And so a lot of people have always talked about the fact that the agreement would have been much stronger with the US's support and would have better curbed China's growth. But since that didn't happen, we've seen sort of an exacerbation of the same major problem. And so this slide was really about that discussion. I think I'm about out of time, but I've come to the end. I believe this should be, could you go one more? Yes, that was it. I thought I had something else, but no, I didn't. So I'm going to stop here. I'll let you guys take a break because it's very difficult to hear me talk for 40 minutes straight. So I applaud you for doing that. We'll come back with questions and I'll try to answer as many of them as I can. Thank you.
Okay, 10-minute break.
Where do you want to meet? I don't know. Do you want me to go what, or do you want to go what?
Meeting and eating or meeting and talking?
Well, get a meeting, set it going. He's got the same thing, you gotta get yourself a chair.
Let's meet close to that.
Very true.
Everybody always has to meet the mill the 21st.
Where are you gonna be?
I was at work, department
I like to eat
16J. I love to meet at the
They've got coffee.
Startup Hotel on East Campus. Innovation Campus. A little bit further away from the Catholic Church. They have a coffee cafe.
Okay.
There's the mill across the street from that Innovation Campus. It's one of my favorites. Liberty Travel.
Not that bad. I think
Yeah.
There's a coffee shop near you, in that Army recruiting station.
Sure.
Used to
Never
be.
known.
Yeah, I had a couple people there. Yeah, 'cause the name is Bloom?
I just imagine.
I'm probably
No, I think I might go
I
over.
do that
I've got
one.
another.
Innovation Campus, a cookie party for you.
Scarlet.
Scarlet Hotel. They're in the comments. I do that a lot too.
If in 3 years the seasons were to change,
Where's this at? Where's it? What you? Oh. Yeah. Well, I was just at another movie. Oh, it was one of the churches.
even just looking at
I think it's called the Good Life Coffee Shop.
you come back and so there's just this idea of everyone
Usually go on Friday.
he lets it sort of show this area it can be okay. And so that same strength of
Well, good to see you.
they're gonna start to look at
Are you doing good? Do you feel like
I did sign.
things are going well?
Overall in life, I don't.
Okay.
I think the world's coming unglued pretty quickly. So I just try to focus on my little niche of it where I have smart, good-looking friends. Where I live, the plumbing works now. It was broken earlier, but it works now. I don't know. Mary and I are going to talk about the environment one day this week.
No.
The city council's doing okay.
I go to CCL meeting when I can.
Yeah, there was.
Well, I see you.
Yeah, they were there yesterday. I went to the Ag Center for the Home and Garden Show yesterday. You been to the Home and Garden Show yet?
No.
They have some really good donuts there.
They're on the egg. Really?
It's on Sand Hills Global Event Center. So about 84th and Holden? Haviland.
Yeah.
Comes out of Haviland. Used to be the Lancaster County Event Center where we did some of that. But it's just people remodeling patios and putting in hot tubs and insulation. So I did that really in CCL. Have a good time at CCL yesterday?
Yeah. I couldn't go to the meeting and I'm a half hour now.
Yeah,
So
so
half
this-
hour away. So
You're at Capitol Beach, right? It's not overall, I think,
I'm depressed with all this stuff going on. I just don't know if my letters or phone calls are making a difference.
I've been invited to go to Southeast Community College on Thursday. It's kind of more of a Black History Month thing. And I've been invited twice this year to do what Martin Luther King meant to me. And I lost my dad in July, so I've been doing a lot of reflecting on life, just in general. But I was thinking about all the protests in Minneapolis, and I'm leaning a little bit more conservative than I'm comfortable with. Yeah, that's the look. That is the appropriate look. That is the appropriate look. So I took a minute and went back and read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, where he actually does a little attack on it. The place of Negroes who won't do anything. But there's so many parallels. And one of the first ones is the government promised they would do something. Like my president promised to just get rid of small groups. Then they didn't do what they promised. They said, let's negotiate. And there's just so many parallels.
Is at the podium,
Nader's got a new book out too.
we have a tablet so the speaker can see and
I'm safe at any speed.
on the tablet because the speaker can't read the small print.
Yeah, we can maybe get a bigger TV for that.
That would be one solution. Another is have a tablet up there.
He wrote a book about the Chevy Corvair. Called Safe at Any Speed.
It's nice to have a screen right there that I can see. because I talk from the screen. I don't have any of the notes.
I can't believe what they did. It's wonderful.
It just occurred to me that
Those
either a
people could
larger
come out
screen
there.
or a
Yeah,
tablet up there.
We're looking at getting a
I-
possibly bigger screen.
I think it's a wonderful town.
16
I'm
months,
inspired
so maybe
by
next year
it.
we'll have some.
I think that is
Probably
most
there's nothing
American
can be done.
town.
And all the
in
people
America.
who are going up there,
Yeah.
the lawyers and everything, are going up there to try and help the pastors.
Yeah, well, they may be struggling, but they're doing better than the rest of
We're
the
being labeled as outsiders, but nobody can be an outsider in the United States.
Well,
If you're in the country, you're an insider.
Fourth
And
talk
Nader
in this
says that we
series,
just have to keep
and I'm gonna have to
looking, and the
keep
more
looking
of us
at
that are
the
there all the
screens
time, the better it's
because
gonna be.
those are my
I
notes.
think
I may have, I'm
Yeah.
looking at something,
the protesters
and I'll see if I can
pick a fight
do
with
something.
young people. That's what bothers me.
Will you be
Kind of
holding the
undermines our
microphone?
nonviolent protest.
There you go. It's on.
After agitating them,
Okay,
they
watch
want to
test it.
pick a fight.
Well, and every time there's something good, there's
Hello,
always
hello.
something side of it. Yeah.
This is all history.
Seven principal
What ticks you off? I like to watch West Wing too, and some of that stuff, we're still working with that same shit, how many years later, sorry.
20 years later, it's fine. Use that shitty word all the time. I think we've seen it all before. We can see it happening now. And there's nothing we can really do about it until we vote with this in November. And that will be a very big step.
Well, we're not more than just.
I think part of my problem is I want to see everybody say, wait a minute, and just turn this around. My president's got such a good lock hold on everything. We can't turn it around instantly.
Even with what's going on, we're waiting for that one little thing that they're finally gonna get him on, that it's gonna start turning things,
It still won't turn it around for
Well,
2 to 4 years.
more than that probably, yeah.
And then we got keep the people in
Trying, yeah.
continue.
Well, I think we're pretty much the same place we were 8 years ago. The real issue is we have a total right taking people in America. Right now, they're going a little bit more talk, and we need to unempower them, and we need to convert them to quit being racist.
And poverty and stuff, we should be taking care of that a long time ago, and we don't get it done, that's what, I mean, we try to, but we don't.
I don't think we can convince them not to be racist. They have to die off and just kill them all. Kill them all.
Well, and the,
We need to convert 20, 10, 50% of them. They're all American.
Convert you to a conservative Republican.
You know, yeah, I can't get along. I preach conservative climate change. Don't I?
I think you and I are more moderate. We can see those advantages of conservatism. We're not dogmatically far left.
I will point out that I can identify a bunch of super liberal people like Bernie is
Sounds good.
going to work. Elizabeth Warren. You're right. But they
Okay.
I'll forget election.
I'll do that.
He's got one.
yeah,
Yeah, he's got one. The gentleman, the sweater vest.
you can probably still get it.
No, I think if you want, I have three mics.
There's not that many people here, so maybe.
Yep, there's not one. That is fine.
Okay, I think we're ready to resume. I knew. Thank you very much, Steve.
We love Dave. We love Dave.
I knew I would forget something in my introduction a few minutes ago. And what I intended to say, by way of substance, was, as far as I could tell, the America First Committee of 1940-41 did not have an economic agenda. And when Professor Trundle was talking about the America First Committee last week, he didn't mention economics at all. But in a way, the American First Committee didn't have to address economics because Congress was already doing it with the Holy Smoot. So Congress was already trying to build, as I understand it, a kind of fortress America in economic terms. So there was no reason for the America First Committee to address economics. So they addressed political and military intervention in Europe And de facto, they were anti-Semitic and didn't want the U.S. to come to the defense of German Jews or others being persecuted. But Congress was already addressing, in its great wisdom, the Fortress America by way of the Holy Smooth Terror. So there you have a delayed part of the introduction, which pinch hitting I forgot to mention. Okay, as you know, this format now is for Q&A, and Jason will let us know when he has some questions from the folks online. So who would like to address a question to our speaker? And please wait for me to bring the microphone around, or Jarrett also has a microphone. We want to make sure that the people online can hear the question. All right, we have a lady over here.
Okay, thank you. Years ago, I had an opportunity to meet with some Mexican farmers who were particularly critical of the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Put it up to your mouth.
Oh, excuse me. And what they were saying was that agriculture and growing of corn in Mexico was based on a contract basis. And so they wanted to have farmers have small plots of ground, grow farmers, and they would grow corn, and they would be guaranteed a certain price for a certain number of bushels. With the North American Free Trade Agreement, they were flooded with cheap corn coming over in the border, which drove many farmers out of business. And where did these out-of-work farmers go? They came across into the United States, which we didn't like them. But they were really economic refugees at that point that had been created because of this policy. So sometimes I wonder, these agreements that get made all look like big dollar signs here and there, but they don't balance the humanity of what some of these agreements do. So I don't know if it's a question, but were those farmers from Mexico telling me the right stuff?
Definitely. So I'll just repeat the question again. The idea, if allow me to paraphrase your question, but whether or not these trade deals that people sign actually look out for the little guy generally. Like I said when I was kind of talking through this, and I skipped past that point, but the general idea is you're supposed to, if you were trying to avoid the problem that it actually became, then those are the people you want to look out for. But that was not the overall purpose of the agreement. And you are 100% correct, because like I said, trade is this double-edged sword. It works both ways. The U.S. was able to produce corn a lot more efficiently than Mexico was, and so prices of U.S. corn in Mexico were significantly lower. And that was why we saw a lot of Mexican farmers in that context lose their livelihoods, and then that same exacerbation. That's the reason why the middle class was shrinking, and we still saw the same problems that they had. Part of the reason why I was talking about what trade agreements look like now is that those kinds of protections are now part of trade negotiations. In the past, it was mostly just, all right, we're going to make sure that we have these tariffs agreed between these two countries. We make sure that we're buying this specific amount from this country and this specific amount from that country. And so it was more on a macroeconomic basis. But now a lot of those free trade agreements are really getting at this very thing, where you're protecting labor, you're making sure that there aren't those same negative consequences with respect to things like climate change, with respect to things like agricultural degradation, and all of these different aspects that were historically not thought of as part of trade, but are now being really considered. And so modern trade agreements are really trying to address that. And so I completely agree. I think there was a hand up over here.
Well, we have an online question here. Ross asked, are trade deficits bad, and how big does the deficit have to be to become bad?
I'm laughing because I've had students ask me this very question, and it takes me about 30 minutes to answer it, but we don't have 30 minutes. So I'll give you a quick response. Trade deficits in and of itself is not a bad thing. When trade deficits are financed by debt, it can potentially be bad. And then it's the debt you're worried about and not necessarily the trade deficit. This might be a silly way to answer the question that's a very serious thing, but if you go to Walmart and you buy products, right? You buy soap, shampoo, food, you leave and you pay. Technically, if you're calculating trade, you have a trade deficit with Walmart. But are you worse off? No, right? Because you've paid for your goods and your services and you left with stuff, but you didn't sell Walmart anything. So technically you have a trade deficit, but that's not in and of itself a bad thing. Now, a lot of African countries or a lot of developing countries that borrow money from the international market, promising an interest, then turn around and import goods into their country. They're financing their trade deficit with debt, and that's really where you get the negative effects. Now, where trade deficit may potentially be problematic is where you have situations where your production of goods is somehow being negatively influenced by the international trade that you're doing. So you could say things like in the United States, well, we should be producing these goods we're importing, but we're not, and we're seeing a significant amount of high levels of unemployment in certain areas. That's where you could think of trade deficit as potentially being an issue when it starts to affect domestic production. But for the most part, and with a lot of goods, countries, and overall, trade deficit inherently is not a bad thing. It's only under certain situations where it becomes a negative. I'll stop there because there's more I want to say, but I'm not going to do that.
Actually, I'll give you a chance to say more because I'm going to seize the prerogative to follow up on that.
Okay.
I know some economists who say, well, you know, a trade deficit per se is not necessarily a big deal, and they don't understand why our current president has focused on that so much. And I want to use the example of Switzerland because I've lived there quite a bit. And you have the U.S. Putting a certain level of tariff on Switzerland because apparently Switzerland sells us a lot of watches and a lot of chocolates and some pharmaceuticals and whatever. But Switzerland is a friendly neutral. It's democratic, it's capitalist. It represented us in Iran for a long time. It's by no means an adversary. And we're talking about watches and chocolates and pharmaceuticals. What's the big deal with having a trade deficit with Switzerland? Or is it that the president didn't like the female president of Switzerland when she went to the White House and rubbed him the wrong way?
So, a lot of, again, without being there and knowing specifically, a lot of what I've heard come out from news sources, whether or not we trust them, whether or not we know them are true for 100%, is that a lot of the incidences of tariffs that we hear these days is not really driven by any sort of economic rationale. There is a lot of, and I say this, again, I should have said this at the beginning, as a private citizen and not representing UNL in any way, shape, or form, is a lot of it is posturing. And I think it's more along the lines of trying to demonstrate strength as opposed to looking at an underlying issue. Like the use of tariffs in that particular example is not going to be driven by trade deficits. Because again, when you think about how much we trade with Switzerland, we're not buying a lot from Switzerland. There's not really a threat of what we're producing compared to what Switzerland's producing. So that would not be a primary source of concern. So that gives me a reason to suggest that maybe that was because of something else. Or perhaps the pharmaceutical discussion is where this is at. That could also be a possibility, where it's one of these examples where maybe a concession is in play, and the threat of a tariff would allow the president to negotiate certain deals with pharmaceuticals. You just never know. But the general idea is that if you're thinking about trade deficits, if you can afford those goods, then there really isn't a reason to be concerned. Because if you impose a tariff on Switzerland, for example, because of pharmaceuticals, and there's nothing being done in the United States to facilitate the production of pharmaceuticals, then you're just pushing the ball down the line. Nothing is going to change. It's still going to be the exact same thing in a couple of years. So hopefully I've commented on that. I think he had a question. Yeah, I think his hand was up first. Sorry, I will get to you, I promise.
Well, thank you for an interesting talk. It's a complex field for most of us, I think. So I've been involved a little bit in agriculture and things for a while. What I'm looking at in the U.S. and makes me very confused, and maybe most of us in America, is this seeming oligarchy that's building up under the Trump administration, and what kind of international pressure, what kind of economic things are people like Jared Kushner doing, and Witkoff, and blah, blah, blah. And I don't mean to, put you on the line, just your sort of personal opinion. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's never a good thing when a few people control the interests of a bunch. I think that's safe to say. That if you have people's best interests at heart and we believe that that's what they're doing and that they're fighting for the American people, and then that should be okay. It should be a little bit more efficient. But again, we don't know. Incentives are different. We don't necessarily have any strong evidence to suggest A versus B. I guess all we can rely on are what we see coming out of negotiations, what type of deals we're getting. For example, right after the USMCA was renegotiated, the US went into a trade talk with Japan to try to alleviate some of the pressures from the US-China trade war for beef and dairy producers in the United States, to negotiate new markets for them in Japan. And so we could see that as an indication of, oh, this is for the good of the people. It's never clear, at least to me, when I hear discussions or press briefings that come out of the White House, I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of some of this stuff is. I only hear, and for me personally, this is sort of what, when I listen to people talk, what I'm trying to get at is, all right, what is your economic reasoning for doing what you're doing? I always want to hear that. The conversation never seems to go there. It's usually, it's going to be the best for the American people, and that's that. But I would like some more insight. And when you follow up on some of these things, it doesn't give you that same response. So I completely understand the concerns that you have, and I can't say for certain what certain things are. Like I said, we just have to look at what is being negotiated, what is being agreed on, and what their points are. We keep interacting with folks who are carrying out these conversations at the IDER Institute and at UNL and things like that. And so there are certain things that we see that we can point to and say, okay, this is a positive, or this may not necessarily be. Well, like I said, for us, everything is usually net benefit, net cost. If we see that certain beneficial effects are taking place, we'll point to those. If it's negative, we'll point to those as well. It's just very unclear some of the strategies, what they are and what they're intended to do. And for a lot of it, the DNA of the US that a lot of us are used to is very different now. And so some of us don't recognize the policies. And that's why I was very adamant about talking about historical precedences for some of the things that we've seen. It's almost like a return to a different time when things were not as laid out as we would generally tend to see. So it's very difficult to put my finger on it. I know I'm not giving you a straightforward answer, but I'm just as confused as well. I keep looking for what the benefits are, and I think if we find them, we will tell.
On your slide, it showed that tariffs for 25 were $88 billion.
Yes.
And you're saying that is approximately 1 to 3% of the total revenue needed for the United States to...
No, I was saying it was 1% of our GDP, and that's the highest they've ever been. So just to give you some sort of context, the idea is if we are collecting on average 20% of income tax, we're looking at 20% of our GDP, right? And the largest amount of tariffs that we've collected is about 88 million to date, and this was approximately in August of 2025, so a little bit outdated. So let's say it's about 100 million, but about 2%. We have to multiply that by 10 to be able to get to where we need to get to replace income tax. So that was sort of the point that I was making, that you would need incredibly high tariffs to be able to do that, and the more you increase tariffs, the less trade you have, so the less revenue you can collect.
Well, the reason I ask that is, I know Mexicans are #1 trade partner, but China, there was trade deficits of $400 or $500 trillion, and that's only one country. If you start adding those up, and we're talking 10, 15, 20%, how can it not be higher than $88 billion?
That's the interesting piece, because the one thing we'll say about, and I don't know how much time we have, trade deficits are a funny thing to measure. Because sometimes people conflate, like I said, trade deficit with trade debt. China holds a lot of US debt, and so sometimes those numbers get mixed in. I'm not sure it's as high as 500 trillion in deficit. That's a lot, because that's more than US's GDP, and I'm pretty sure that if we look at exports and imports of US trade, it's under 10%, so it should be significantly less. The second thing is that when we think about all of the goods that are being purchased from China, they all don't come from China. They come from different places. And so one of the difficulties of measuring international trade flows is the idea that, so for example, if you take an Apple, an iPhone, you break it apart into different pieces, you'll find that some parts come from Japan, some parts come from Mexico, some parts come here, but when it's assembled, it's easier to just count the entire value of the phone as coming from China. So there's always this exaggeration as to what the actual bilateral trade deficit is. The really big part of Chinese imports to the US is a lot of these cheap goods that we get, right? So think Temu, for example, all of these things that people buy and bring in. Think men's shorts or shoes or things that are created internationally, sometimes by US-driven companies, that come back in. And so that's really where a lot of the deficit is coming from. For example, the US has a prohibitively high tariff on Chinese electrical vehicles. Not a single one makes its way to the United States, right? Because we want to protect our electric vehicle industry in the US. So that one is a tariff that has always been, and this is across every single administration. This is not just a Republican or, everybody agrees on that. The other things that we buy are things that have been deemed pseudo-necessary, that we don't necessarily produce in the US, again, because it's more efficient to get it from China, just like we buy coffee from Colombia. We don't produce it here. There was a lot of discussion about if we wanted to keep coffee production in the US, there are a few farms in Hawaii that produce coffee, but they're nowhere near ready to meet the demands for the US market, not even close. And so there is still going to be that need to bring in these goods from these different areas. And so that's really where the difficulty is coming from. And as we were having the conversation, I mentioned to you about the strength of the US dollar, right? And this is one of the things that creates that really high deficit. Because when you think about how far the US dollar goes in other countries, you're able to buy a lot more internationally than domestically. So even when you consider these tariffs or transportation costs that are high, it's still cheaper to buy from foreign countries just because of how strong the US dollar is. And so what would go a long way to actually decreasing that deficit is for the US dollar to lose value. That would actually create an incentive for people in the US to buy less foreign goods, because now it's going to be more expensive. So from an econ perspective, and I tell my students this all the time, it's not something anybody wants to hear, but if you devalue the US dollar, your trade deficit will come down.
Jason has a couple of
I have two
questions
questions.
from people online.
Sorry, I have to let him ask his question before.
Oh, please, no, please, go ahead, sir.
Yes, go ahead. Him, right there.
Microphone here.
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
With regard to the current administration's tax policies, who is actually paying for these tariffs? Is it the American people, or in fact is this other countries?
Oh, no, it's the American people. So I want the opportunity to actually talk about this, because this delves a little bit more into the econ of tariffs. The idea is that The way this works, there are importers in the US that are US citizens that are buying these goods from foreign countries. When they buy those goods and come to the border, to accept their payments, they have to pay the tariff. I'll give you a very simple example. I ordered lights for my daughter, and it turns out it was on Etsy. I didn't know who I was buying it from. Turns out it was coming in from Pakistan. It came into the country, and about 2 weeks later, I got a letter from UPS saying, hey, Uche, you have to pay us $2.60 for the tariffs that we had to pay to get your goods into the country. And I paid it. So that's me paying for those things, right? Now, where this discussion, or this idea that foreign countries pay for it, it comes from this concept of, again, a kind of concession that comes from tariffs. So if the US is a large enough economy, right, where a foreign country knows that it's a consolidated market of relatively wealthy people and they can actually pay for my goods, I only have to transport goods to this one place and I'll sell out all of my goods. If the US puts a tariff, there is a possibility that I might have to reduce my cost, right, to then be able to be more competitive in this market now that there's an additional price. So perhaps that concession is where people have sort of taken the liberty of saying, oh, the foreign country is going to pay for it. Not necessarily. Even though there's still perhaps a reduction in price, you still see an increase in price domestically because you split the burden.
That should be viewed by the Americans as a tax increase.
Exactly. No, definitely. It is definitely an increase because there is never a way for you to 100% push all of the additional increase in price to an exporter. No such supply curve exists that allows that to happen. So you are still going to split that burden. It may not be as high as the tariff that you impose, but it definitely will increase the price of the goods that you pay. Now, whether or not the importers choose to share some of that burden with you, because sometimes there is wiggle room in their profit margin to absorb some of those taxes, so the pass-through is not as great. But if those tariffs remain for long enough, they will be passed on.
From online here,
Yes.
One viewer asked, what was the website that you mentioned early as a good source of export-import trends?
Yes, that was the Yider Institute for International Trade and Finance. It is part of UNL's INR school or college or whatever you want to call it, the Institute for Agriculture and Natural Resources. Just Google Yider Institute, YEUTTER. UNL. It should take you to their website. There are a lot of resources that are really good there. They'll have links to all of these different things.
And last question we have from online. It's a fun one.
Good.
I can think of all kinds of bad things cryptocurrency can fund in international trade. Is cryptocurrency necessary to fund any good things in international trade?
Necessary? No. I have a healthy fear of cryptocurrency. I'm not going to let my fear color other people, but I will say this. Cryptocurrency has value because it's based on just random faith. It is not relying on anything. Its value grows and disappears by just speculation only. Whether or not it can facilitate international trade is not something that is necessary because not a lot of people will accept it because of how volatile it is. It goes to the discussion of whether or not cryptocurrency can be considered money or not. And in my opinion, it can't. The reason I say it can't is if you think about money being valuable because it's backed by the central bank, nobody backs cryptocurrency. If you lose cryptocurrency value, you don't really get that much in return. So if, as a trader, why would I want to hold cryptocurrency when you have my goods that have real value that I can sell for currency that I can get in other countries? So I don't think it's necessary to facilitate international trade, but I can see situations where it may potentially be useful. I will say, and I think we have a question over there, but I will say that while cryptocurrency itself is not necessarily on my top 10 list of things that I want to see involved with international trade, the underlying technology, blockchain, can actually help us address those trade deficit issues that we talk about, because it's essentially a ledger system that records any kind of activity that we can use to track the movement of goods and services across the globe, so we can actually identify what contribution, for example, China had made to the production of the iPhone, so we can get more accurate measures of trade deficit. So The underlying technology, blockchain and the ledger system, yay. The cryptocurrency, not so much. Yes.
I have heard you say, I think a half a dozen times today, that you're reluctant to make judgments about why this administration is making decisions because they are not sharing that information with you. I don't know about finance. I do know about healthcare. And I can listen to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talk, and I know perfectly well, with no doubt, that much of what he says has nothing to do with healthcare. It has nothing to do with science. It has nothing to do with making America healthy. And I am therefore, without a doubt, never looking for his excuses about his healthcare initiatives and how it is going to make America healthier, to put up statements about how vaccines have not been proven effective in this or that or the other situation. So I am sitting here wondering why it is that an economist is listening to Trump not explain, and his other people not explain, and not simply coming to the assumption that I make about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
So that is an excellent question, and here is, I think there's a personal me, and then there's a professional me, and I think that's really where the dichotomy comes from, because if I think about, and this is something that I do a lot, I think about giving people the benefit of the doubt. I think about all the possible things that this administration might be trying to accomplish, right? I think about long-term effects. If we are thinking very generously about some of the proposals that are being made, let's assume that this strategy of using international trade or threatening people with tariffs actually does accomplish some things that maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 years time it's actually beneficial. I can't predict that now. And I think that's where my hesitation to basically say no comes from. And I think for me, when I'll give you a very simple example. When the discussion of reciprocity when it comes to tariffs came about, what I was going to talk about in class that day, I just basically canceled it. And I talked for 75 minutes straight about how none of what was said was economically viable. All right, because a lot of the reciprocal tariffs that were put in place were not going to accomplish anything, and I was very clear about that. So when there is a specific idea that has been put forward, I can challenge that. But when the discussion is more along the lines of, we've put this in, and we're hoping for different outcomes. It depends on how people react. So we just have no choice but to wait and see. I think the health discussion is a little bit more present. And we've sort of seen some of the consequences of taking vaccines for granted. Like I got a notification from my daughter's daycare about measles cases that have been seen in Lincoln. I'd never gotten that before, and we've been going there for about 4 years, right? But there has to be some kind of correlation between those two things. And so there's been some immediacy that we've seen. But in the case of the economic consequences, we're seeing higher tariffs. We're still seeing significant trade blows. We're seeing opportunities being created. So it's, as much as I would want to say, and I'm 100% sure that consumers are paying more right now. So in the short run, I can conclude that tariffs will have that negative effect. But in the long run, because I don't know exactly how people will react, I can't say that all of this is going to be for naught. And that's just me, from a professional standpoint, trying not to jump the gun, just basically saying that, let's wait and see. My colleagues and I talk about this a lot. In about 7 to 10 years, we're going to write some very interesting papers about the consequences of all of these things in the short and the long run. It's just very difficult for us to see what those things are going to be right now. So I completely understand your perspective, and it's just very difficult for us to basically say from a professional standpoint that there are no potential positives from all of this. It'll just depend on how people react.
Please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you very much.
Please remember there is no lecture next Sunday, but then we have 2 more after that. So next week, spring break, and then 2 more. Thank you for coming.
See, March 1st?
I think it's like the 6th, isn't it?
Did you see I changed my mind?
I'm excited you did. How are you? When we met about 2 years ago, 3 years ago? I guess it was just last year before the election. How about you boys doing?
See, the money goes to the government, but maybe the.
You have family here, and you can get arrested every now and then?
No, I don't. I got friends, I'm not lacking money. I can get people in the city.
Yeah, it's a lot to discuss.